Welcome to Graphing Functions Part 2. We're going to look at two graphs. Now, one way you can think of domain and range are as follows. Your domain represents how far to the left and right, or in the x direction, you can go while looking at this curve on the Cartesian plane. So if I were to highlight in green how far this curve exists from left to right, we could say that anywhere between 1 and 8, the curve exists. Horizontally, we're speaking of how far to the left or right the curve exists. Now notice that if I trace this up to where this dot is, this dot on the far left end of the curve is at the point 1, 5. So you can see that the coordinate point for my x values start at 1. Now let's look at the end point. The end point to the right is at 8, -1, 2, 3, 4. And the 8 is specifically what we're looking at because we're looking at how far to the left or right it goes. When we determine this, that is my domain. So the domain of this function is all the inputs that will give me corresponding outputs or range values. My domain is going to exist from 1 to 8. 1 is included because I have an a closed dot at 1, and 8 is not included because there's an open dot at 8. Now let's look at the range. The range is how high and low the graph gets. So I'll use yellow to represent that. Notice that it starts at 5 and it continues to move downward, downward, downward to -5. Notice that it does not get any lower than -5. So if I look at my graph, the lowest point on this graph is the point 5, -5. So my range values go from the lowest point is at -5, and I'm going to include the endpoint because it's the minimum. And it goes as high as 5. And since this is a closed dot, we can put a bracket on that side as well. Looking at B, we'll do the same thing. Anything to the left of 2, including 2, because there is a starting point, a closed dot at 2, 5. We can include 2, and anything to the left of 2. So for my domain values, I have -infinity to 2, including 2. Now let's look at the range values. We need to know how high and low this graph exists. Well, we can see from this graph the highest point is 5. But this graph, if we extend it, it just keeps going downward. And so the high point is at 5, and it just keeps going downward, which means that the graph will continue toward -infinity for the low point. So my range is going to be from -infinity to 5, including 5, because 5 had a closed dot. So remember, domain values is how far the curve exists left to right, and range values are how far the graph exists from lowest to highest.